Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to talk about a truly terrifying event that, luckily for us, is very unlikely to ever happen, but nonetheless we're going to discuss anyway. What would happen if the Flood were to invade planet Earth in 2019? So today I figured that I'd sort of try something different to my usual content and try and blend one of everyone's favourite aspects of Halo lore with real life. So if you do enjoy this video at any point and you do want to see more like it, then leaving a like and also subscribing if you're new here would definitely help out a ton. So, us humans, myself definitely in particular, have a massive fascination with zombies, and honestly, I feel like in most cases, humanity would be fairly prepared for a regular zombie outbreak. But with that said, the Flood are definitely not your regular zombies. They're stronger, they're more varied, and they are far more intelligent than any other variant of the undead, both realistic and unrealistic. So how would modern humanity fare against the Flood? Let's find out. Okay, so most zombie outbreaks tend to start with a patient zero getting infected and then becoming a vector for the infection to spread. However, that doesn't really fit the Flood, so I'm going to deal with how their outbreak on Earth begins in a different way, and to do so, I'm going to take some liberties from another very popular zombie universe. In 1908, a mysterious meteor exploded above the Tunguska River in the Yeniseisk Governorate of Russia. The explosion destroyed 2,000 square kilometers of forest, but weirdly caused no human casualties. This event was later dubbed the Tunguska event, and despite over 100 years of research, we still don't know for sure if it really was a meteor that caused the massive devastation. However, in the zombies universe, we do. Large fragments of the Tunguska meteor made landfall and brought with it the notorious Element 115, which was used by the Germans to inadvertently create zombies during World War II. For the purpose of today's video, let's imagine that a large fragment of the Tunguska meteor did land in Yeniseisk, but in 2019 and not in 1908, and instead of carrying Element 115, it brought with it a horde of infection forms. Basically, just imagine if this meteor that detached from High Charity and brought the Flood down to the Ark in Halo 3 landed in Siberia. So, there's now a horde of, let's say, 50 infection forms free to roam around Siberia. The Flood outbreak on Earth has officially begun. The Flood's #1 priority at the start of an outbreak is to collect enough biomass to form a proto-gravemind, allowing them to evolve into the upper echelons of the feral stage of their evolution. So, naturally, the first thing that they do is look for human hosts to infect, and it just so happens that there's a densely populated town nearby, the town of Yeniseisk, home to over 18,000 possible combat forms. Despite the freezing cold temperatures of as low as -58 degrees centigrade, the humans' ignorance of the Flood presence would ultimately be their undoing, and the infection forms would begin to create combat forms with ease. But you might be thinking, there's only 50 infection forms, that means that only 50 people out of the 18,000 could be infected, right? Not true. Combat forms are actually more than capable of spreading the Flood infection themselves, we've just never seen it happen in the games. Basically, the core building block of the Flood is a cell known as the Flood supercell, an undifferentiated cell type that once planted inside a host sparks the rapid mutation from healthy human to twisted combat form. Just like other infections and viruses, all it takes for this Flood supercell to be transferred is the transfer of bodily fluids, and the primary way that combat forms have been known to do that is by biting. So as soon as the combat forms are created, they can get to spreading the infection too. Because of the anarchy and the general disarray that the town would be in at this point, it'd be pretty much a field day for the Flood, and 99.9% of its population would likely be infected in mere hours. With the biomass of roughly 18,000 people in their hands, the Flood would almost certainly be able to construct a proto-gravemind, which would make them far more intelligent and lethal than before. That said though, by this point, the Russian government would have almost certainly been alerted to this major biohazard threat that just took over one of its towns and consumed 18,000 of its people. And so it'd have a quarantine zone set up around the town, locking it down, while some of its top scientists tried to figure out just what the fuck was actually going on. Russian NBC and Spetsnaz would be on the ground in full force, and I imagine after not too long, a task force would be assembled and sent into the quarantine zone to assess the situation, and maybe even to gather samples of the parasite for scientists to test on. However, as good of an idea as I'm sure it sounds to send in your most elite, knowledgeable troops armed to the teeth, the humans would actually be ignorant of the fact that this plays directly into the Flood's playbook. Aside from a few shotguns, hunting rifles, and pistols that people in the town may own, the combat forms are still mostly locked into melee-only combat. That is about to change. As elite and well-trained as the Russian Spetsnaz and NBC forces are, even they could not be prepared for the Flood, and so I imagine that they'd be repurposed by the parasite pretty quickly. But their bodies wouldn't be all that was repurposed. Their weapons and the knowledge to use them would be too. That means that combat forms would now be armed with the likes of AK-74s, AKMs, SVDs, AS-Vals, SV-98s, maybe even flamethrowers and incendiary equipment if the NBC used them, and even worse than this, the combat forms are now as efficient with these weapons as the Spetsnaz were, because when a host is consumed, so is all of their knowledge. Using this newfound tactical knowledge on top of their huge numbers, the Flood would be able to overrun the quarantine checkpoints with ease, expanding their blightlands and growing their numbers and firepower. Given that at this point it'd probably be a day or two since the beginning of the outbreak, the construction of a Flood hive in the town would already be well underway, possibly even complete, especially with the amount of biomass they have on hand. Spore mountains will have been created to begin secreting Flood spores into the air, which although initially is only used to create the hive, would actually mark the beginning of the end of humanity. Eventually, the government would probably deem the area as a lost cause and enact a scorched earth policy, retreating any remaining uninfected forces before napalming the town until there's no Flood biomass left. However, at this point, it's too little too late. The amount of Flood spores released into the atmosphere has turned the Flood infection airborne. All it takes is for somebody to inhale oxygen containing a spore, and it has the exact same effect on them as if an infection form were to jump on them and grapple their neck. This means that by this time, the infection would have spread to and begun infecting all of the other towns on the Tunguska River, officially marking the Flood outbreak out of control. Given how spores work, they'd continue to spread across mainland Russia, infecting towns and cities without residents even knowing until it's too late. Despite the Russian and likely now international efforts to keep it contained, the Allies would always be one step behind the Flood, or honestly about 7 steps behind. Ports and airports would be closed and the Russian border would be locked down with nobody going in or out. Obviously, spores don't give a shit about borders, and to be fair, with how fast the Flood spreads, I doubt the borders would even last that long with how many combat forms and infection forms and carrier forms there'd be in mainland Russia by now. With the borders overrun and the Flood airborne, the parasite would easily begin to spread across Asia before eventually making it to Europe. Given how widespread it is now, international forces would find it almost impossible to contain, and would have to resort to creating safe haven countries where the infection is yet to spread to. Because of this, countless proto-gravemines would start popping up, and given the sheer amount of biomass, possibly even regular gravemines too, and most of the East would just become one massive Flood hive. As it spreads throughout Europe, NATO forces would be deployed, and the UN would likely try to mass distribute gas masks to citizens, because by now, I'd hope at least that they'd figured out that the Flood are airborne. Ultimately though, we know how this story of resistance against the Flood goes. Any form of defense force, even one that's comprised of the SAS, the Navy SEALs, JTF2, and like every other remaining elite special forces team on planet Earth, would still get demolished by the Flood. Now that there's multiple proto-gravemines and possibly even regular gravemines scattered across the planet, the Flood are far too intelligent and numbered to be stopped. Despite attempts to napalm it, bomb it, hell, even nuke it, within a short amount of time, everything east of the Atlantic would be nothing but a Flood hive. And so, that leaves the Americas as humanity's final stronghold. Now, technically, given that Russia is fully infected, the Flood could have just spread across this tiny gap between Russia and Alaska, but for the sake of making this final stand just that bit more epic, let's say that it's too cold up there for the flood to spread, which honestly isn't entirely incorrect. So, all that's standing between the flood and total planetary assimilation is the Atlantic Ocean. How do they cross it? Well, I can say for sure that they don't swim. Given that they now have the collective knowledge of Asia, Africa, Australia, and Europe, I think it's safe to say that they know how to sail a boat and fly a plane. Given that the Americas would be humanity's last hope, I'd imagine that they'd be more than prepared for the flood to assault by air and by sea, but I don't see even the most prepared, geared up defense force being ready for the sheer number of flood forms that'd be about to be sent their way. Maybe they'd be able to hold off for a day, maybe two at best, but they're really just delaying the inevitable at this point. Eventually, North and South America would fall to the flood, leaving only Antarctica free of infection. Now, because of the absolutely blisteringly low temperatures it can get to in Antarctica, as low as like minus 89 degrees, it'd be extremely hard for the flood to spread there. A little known fact is that on the Halo rings, the Forerunners would use the Halo's artificial weather systems to lower the temperature at the site of a flood outbreak because they found that it halts their spreading. Why else do you think that Quarantine Zone in Halo 2 was covered in snow? So it wouldn't be impossible, it'd just be really hard. Although, to be fair, I don't think its average population of 1,000 people would be enough to pose any threat to the flood. And therefore, I can say, based on my extremely precise scientific calculations, that if the flood were to invade planet Earth in 2019, we'd all be infected in a matter of days. Toward the end of the Forerunner Flood War, they were able to consume entire planets in just a few days. So to say that it'd happen almost equally as fast at a time when humanity is infinitely less technologically advanced than the Forerunners, I don't think is too much of a stretch. Ultimately, I think it's fair to say that we would be royally fucked. So, if you watched the entire thing and got to this point, then thank you so much. I really hope that you enjoyed. A lot of hard work and a shitload of effort went into this video, and of course, a lot of love too. So if you did enjoy, then again, leaving a like and also subscribing if you haven't already will go a very long way to help me. I'd very much appreciate it. I want to give a big thank you to all of my amazing patrons for supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. And thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one.